A wheel vanished. Not metaphorically, not in some bureaucratic filing error that got quietly sorted out years later. A physical, metal, left front wheel assembly came off a maroon and black Pontiac stock car at roughly 160 miles per hour on lap 5 of the Budweiser at the Glen on August 11, 1991, and it simply disappeared from the face of the earth. Nobody at NASCAR has ever publicly explained where it ended up. The family of the man it killed never got it back. And that missing wheel is the single most important piece of evidence in understanding why a 52-year-old independent driver named J.D. McDuffie died that Sunday afternoon, and why the sport he devoted his entire life to spent the next decade pretending his death was an isolated tragedy instead of a screaming, unmistakable warning that should have changed everything immediately. This is Motorsport Heritage, and I spend way too much time thinking about the forgotten crashes that shaped modern NASCAR safety. If you're someone who believes the real history of motorsport lives in the stories nobody wants to tell, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Here's the thing about NASCAR in the summer of 1991. You absolutely have to understand the contrast, because without it, the entire story collapses into nonsense. By 1991, Winston Cup racing had become a $1 million a season proposition per car. The Greensboro News and Record printed that exact figure the morning after McDuffie died, and every single garage worker in the sport already knew it in their bones. Rick Hendrick was running multi-car operations backed by truck stop money. Junior Johnson had Budweiser on the hood. Richard Childress had Goodwrench. Dale Earnhardt was Dale Earnhardt. Roger Penske was already setting up shop. Television rights were being negotiated at figures that would have made the founders of the sport faint dead away. Sponsors were paying for full body wraps that cost more than some teams' entire annual operating budget. Look, this was not the bootlegger and moonshiner federation that started racing on the beach at Daytona 40 years earlier. This was a national brand, a corporate machine, and it was ravenous for growth. Tracks were repaving and reconfiguring at a furious pace. The money was pouring in from every conceivable direction. And then, standing in the middle of all that corporate machinery like a ghost from another century, was J.D. McDuffie. Sanford, North Carolina. A shop he had built with his own two hands. A 1970 Chevrolet Ramp truck. He called all blue that he drove himself to the racetracks because he simply could not afford a proper hauler. 3 race cars sitting on the property, every single one of them covered in somebody else's old fingerprints. A pit crew made up of guys who had day jobs during the week and were not getting paid a single dollar to be there on Sunday. A sponsor list that read like the yellow pages of small-town Carolina. Rumpel Furniture out of Ellenboro. Sons Auto Supply. Bailey Excavating. Classic Trophies. Hometown businesses paying hometown money so a hometown guy could keep showing up at the racetrack. His average per race payday in 1991 was about $2,000. His total career Winston Cup earnings across 28 years and 653 starts came to roughly $1,338,000. Now, here's what most people don't realize about that number. That entire career total, 28 years of racing and 653 starts, was less than what a top driver like Dale Earnhardt was making in a single race weekend by 1991. Let that sink in for a second. Nearly 3 decades of showing up, and the total payout was less than one good Sunday for the guys at the front of the field. J.D. McDuffie was the last man standing of an era the sport was actively trying to forget. The structural failure that killed him was not just a broken spindle on a tired race car. The structural failure was a sport that had created 2 completely different classes of competitor on the same racetrack and was not willing to publicly acknowledge that fact. Both classes were racing through the same corners at the same speeds, and the sport was perfectly comfortable collecting entry fees from both of them without ever asking whether that arrangement was actually sustainable or safe. So who was this guy? John Deluse McDuffie Jr. was born on December 5, 1938, in Upper Little River Township in Harnett County, North Carolina. His daddy was John Delphus Sr. His mama was Ruby Lee Dean McDuffie. He had a brother named Glenn. He was 10 years old when somebody took him to Bowman Gray Stadium in Winston-Salem for the first time, and that was effectively the end of him doing anything else with his life. He used to talk about Curtis Turner and Glenn Wood and Billy Myers as his heroes, the guys who made him believe that a kid from rural North Carolina could actually make a life behind the wheel of a race car. He started running short tracks in his teens and won a track championship at a little dirt track near Rockingham in the early 1960s. By July 7, 1963, he was making his NASCAR Grand National debut at Ramby Raceway in Myrtle Beach, driving Curtis Turner's old 1961 Ford, which Curtis himself had outgrown. He qualified 14th and finished 12th out of 18 cars. There was another driver named Floyd Powell already using the number 70 on the regional circuits, so McDuffie's Ford ran with just a big painted letter X on the door for a while. As soon as he could, he claimed 70 back. He picked 70, he said, because it was easy to paint and easy to remember. In 1959, he had married a woman named Imogene Wood, and they would have 2 kids together. A son named Jeffrey Wayne, born in 1962, who would eventually serve as his daddy's crew chief and even make 5 Winston Cup starts of his own, and a daughter named Linda Karen. The whole life was built out of Sanford. The shop, the hauler, the family, the identity. It all came from one zip code in the middle of North Carolina. Now, you might be thinking, well, if he was that dedicated, he must have been a great driver who just never got the right equipment. And that is a natural assumption, but it is not quite right. J.D. McDuffie was never going to be confused with Petty or Pearson or Yarborough. He did not have the raw talent of those guys, and he never pretended he did. But he had something else entirely. He had what Marty Burke, who ran his crew for years, called the quality of being a man of his word. He chewed Tampa Nugget cigars in the cockpit, usually with his open-faced helmet on. He wore grease-spotted tennis shoes in the garage, jeans, a Navy Sun's auto supply shirt, a Rumpel furniture cap. Greensboro columnist Ron Green called him a walking, talking, driving museum piece, and that was not an insult. It was a precise description. The guy looked like he had walked out of a 1957 modified race, and just never stopped. The peak years came earlier than most people remember. In 1971, he finished 9th in Winston Cup points, which was the best year of his career. His career best finish came that same year, a 3rd place at Albany-Saratoga Speedway in Malta, New York, in a 100-miler. In 1973, he finished 10th in point. He had legitimate top 10 potential as a driver if he had been in the right car, which he never really was. And then came the moment that defined his entire career. On September 17, 1978, at Dover Downs, he qualified a chassis he had bought from Richard Childress Racing on the pole position for the Delaware 500 at 135.480 miles per hour. He was the only car on McCreary tires while everybody else was on Goodyear, and he stuck it on the pole. He led the first 10 laps before Bobby Allison got around him, and then he blew the engine on lap 80 and finished 33rd. But for one Sunday afternoon at Dover, J.D. McDuffie had been the fastest driver in NASCAR's top division. That was his one pole. He never won a race. He never finished higher than 3rd. But for one weekend, he was officially the best of them all. Because of that pole, he was invited to the inaugural Busch Clash at Daytona in 1979, a special race for pole winners only. He drove with men like Petty and Allison and Yarborough as an equal. It was the highest his profile would ever be in the sport, and it happened more than a decade before the crash that ended everything. By the mid-1980s, the sport was passing him by at a speed he simply could not match. He was still good company in the garage. He was still everybody's friend. Darrell Waltrip and Junior Johnson actually trusted him enough that at Riverside in November of 1982, they put him in Junior's second car as a championship insurance policy, so that if Waltrip's primary car wrecked in practice or qualifying, Waltrip would have somewhere to go without giving up his points. McDuffie got a steering wheel that day because Junior Johnson and Darrell Waltrip thought he could be trusted not to wreck it. That tells you exactly where he stood with the people who knew the sport from the inside. He was respected. He was reliable. But he was also running out of time and money simultaneously. The financial problem just kept getting worse with every passing season. He was building his own engines because he could not afford to buy them from the top shop. He was running parts that other teams considered worn out, and he ran them for another full year because he had no choice. Marty Burke put it this way years later. He said J.D. never ran junk. The parts might have been used, but they were not wore out. He had to run conservatively to preserve his equipment because if something broke, there was no replacement coming. There was no second engine in the trailer. There was no backup plan of any kind. In 1984, his son Jeff got in a car accident. McDuffie received an insurance check from that accident, and he took every single dollar of his own son's insurance money and put it into the race team to keep it going for another week or two. That is not me editorializing. That is Ron Green of the Greensboro News and Record, writing it in McDuffie's obituary in August 1991. The man poured his kid's accident money into a race car because the race car was the family business and the family business was about to starve to death. In February 1988, he showed up to Daytona for the Twin 125 qualifying race and discovered that somebody had stolen his fireproof gloves out of the garage. There was no replacement set in the truck, so he drove the qualifier without glove. He came out of that car with second and third-degree burns across both hands. When he came back to the racetrack the next year, his hands were still puffy and red, and he was racing again because there was no other option. He told a reporter that same year, and I quote, "Racing is my life. If I don't run, I don't eat. This ain't a weekend hobby to me." This is where it gets really interesting because that quote is not just a colorful anecdote. It is the raw economic reality that explains everything that happened next. By the late 1980s, he was missing more races than he was making. 7 starts in 1989. 8 starts in 1990. The Hutcherson-Pagan Pontiacs he ran when he could get the money together were good cars, but his shop did not have the resources to repair them quickly when something happened. And things kept happening. So we arrive at February 1991 and Speed Weeks at Daytona, which is the moment that tells you everything you need to know about McDuffie's standing in the garage and the brutal economics he was up against. He showed up for Daytona with one engine. That was the entire budget. He went out for practice and the engine blew up. With no second engine in the trailer, McDuffie made the call to start loading up all blue and head back to Sanford because there was no money to rent a replacement motor and there was certainly no money to buy one. He had driven 500 miles to come home empty-handed. And then the garage came to him. The version that everybody agrees on is that Dale Earnhardt and Richard Childress walked through the garage with a hat in their hands, and they collected $6,600 in cash from competing teams, from the very corporate operations that were squeezing the privateers out of the sport entirely. They handed J.D. McDuffie the cash so he could rent an engine and make the Twin 125. He took that engine and he made the field. He finished 21st in his qualifier. He did not make the Daytona 500, but he was on the racetrack for what he had come there to do. That moment tells you the men inside the sport understood what he was. They knew this was the last of them, and they were not going to let him go home without trying. The 1991 season got harder from there. The blue Hutcherson-Pagan Pontiac got wrecked at Talladega in May. Then the red Hutcherson-Pagan car got wrecked at Dover when Kenny Wallace, driving a substitute ride for the injured Kyle Petty, spun McDuffie into the inside wall. That left him with one car, the oldest one, the third car in the inventory. It was an ex-Richard Childress racing chassis, one of Dale Earnhardt's old Wrangler Chevrolets from earlier in the 1980s. Childress had sold it in 1986 to a man named Tom Winkle out of Defiance, Ohio, who had it rebodied into a Pontiac configuration. When Winkle backed out of his racing program later that same year, McDuffie ended up with the car. That was the car going to Watkins Glen. The oldest one. The bottom of the inventory. The absolute fallback. And here is where you have to understand Watkins Glen as a racetrack in 1991, because what was about to happen had been telegraphed for years. The course is 2.428 miles of road racing in upstate New York. Beautiful country, brutal layout. The fastest section is the back straight, which runs about 2,600 feet flat out, at the end of which is a corner called the Loop. Turn 5. An embanked right-hander that you arrive at carrying everything the car will give you and that you have to scrub off enormous speed for in a tremendous hurry. There was no gravel trap on the outside. There was Armco steel guardrail backed by a stack of tires. Think of it like driving a car at highway speed toward a brick wall with a thin mattress leaning against it. That is essentially what Turn 5 was in 1991. In 1989, Jeff Bodine blew a tire entering the loop and hit that tire barrier head-on. He walked away. Then on June 30, 1991, just 6 weeks before McDuffie's race, Tommy Kendall came into Turn 5 in a Camel GT prototype and suffered a wheel failure. He hit the same tire barrier in roughly the same spot. He broke both of his legs and was effectively done as a sports car prototype driver for the season. The pattern was already established. Wheel failures and tire failures coming into the fastest corner on the course, with a tire barrier backed by steel and no runoff area to speak of. The Sanford team rolled into Watkins Glen on Thursday, August 8, 1991. 6 crew guys. Jeff McDuffie as crew chief. Marty Burke, Mike Demers, Jerry Glenn, Don Owens, Ed Peters, and a Canadian named George Secordina. All Blue had blown its brakes on the way up, and McDuffie had jammed a pop rivet into the brake line to plug the leak so they could keep driving. That is how they got to the racetrack, with a pop rivet in the hauler brake line. While every other team was rolling in with 18-wheelers and full tool trailers, J.D. McDuffie was nursing a 21-year-old ramp truck up the interstate with hardware store improvisation. Sunday, August 11, 1991. Heavy overcast at Watkins Glen. Around 125,000 spectators on hand. 40-car field. ESPN was broadcasting with Bob Jenkins in the booth and Benny Parsons stationed at Turn 1 and Ned Jarrett stationed on the exit of Turn 5, about 75 feet from where the crash was about to happen. McDuffie ate breakfast that morning with the team and paid the tab using the cash he had won the night before at a charity race at Shangri-La Speedway, where he had absolutely cleaned up against a field that included paid appearances by Earnhardt and Dale Jarrett. He went to the drivers' meeting wearing his son's auto supply shirt, jeans, and his Rumpel furniture cap, and Ernie Irvin made a joke at him. Ernie said, "J.D., you smoked them last night, didn't you? You've been holding out on us all these years." McDuffie laughed. The race went green. Lap 1, lap 2, lap 3, lap 4. He was running in the back of the field where he always ran, just trying to survive, just trying to finish, just trying to bring it home and collect a payday. On lap 5, he came down the back straight at full song with the rest of the field, heading into the loop, heading into Turn 5, the fastest part of the racetrack. And the left front wheel spindle on the number 70 Pontiac broke. The piece of hardware that connects the wheel to the suspension structurally failed. The brakes failed instantly because the brake assembly is attached to the wheel hub. The steering became irrelevant. The left front wheel and tire simply departed the car. McDuffie was now coming into the fastest corner on the racetrack at roughly 160 miles per hour with no brakes and no functional left front. He clipped Jimmy Means's right front fender. Both cars left the racetrack. Means was able to bleed off some speed. McDuffie's car had nothing to brake with. It crossed the grass at almost full speed and hit the Armco-backed tire barrier passenger side first at an estimated 160 miles per hour. The car launched into the air, rotated about 180 degrees, and came back down inverted on its roof. Jimmy Means climbed out of his car, walked over to the inverted 70, looked inside, and immediately began frantically waving his arms for the safety crew. He told Ned Jarrett on ESPN a minute later that it was so bad he closed his eyes. J.D. McDuffie was dead in the cockpit. He had died on impact. On pit road, Ed Peters, one of the crewmen, leaned against the pit wall and said quietly that he guessed J.D. went out in style. That was the first thing anybody from the team said. NASCAR red flagged the race for 1 hour and 48 minutes to extract the body, clear the wreck, and repair the barrier. During the red flag, NASCAR Public Relations Director Chip Williams handed a statement to Jerry Punch on ESPN and to Bill Bowers at MRN. He said, "I regret to inform you that J.D. McDuffie has passed away. He was 53 years old." Williams had the age wrong by 1 year. McDuffie was 52. He would not have turned 53 until December. Bob Jenkins eulogized him on the air. And then Benny Parsons, whose own wife Connie had died earlier in 1991 at Pocono, came on the broadcast and spoke directly to Imogen McDuffie watching at home. He said, "Jean, I know exactly what you're going through, sweetheart. There's not a one of these drivers that wants to be in that race car right now. I don't want to be here now. It is one of the most extraordinary live moments in the history of NASCAR television, and Benny Parsons absolutely meant every single word of it. Now, you might be thinking that after a fatality like this, NASCAR would have launched a thorough investigation, preserved all the evidence, and figured out exactly what went wrong so it would never happen again. That is a completely reasonable expectation. And it is exactly what did not happen. NASCAR did not conduct a serious investigation of the crash. The race went on. The body was sent to Schuyler Hospital in Montour Falls, New York, where a doctor performed the autopsy and told reporters that McDuffie had died of severe head injuries with a skull fracture and severe brain injuries. NASCAR's interpretation emphasized rapid head movement to the right at the moment of impact, which is the textbook clinical description of what would later be called a basilar skull fracture. The same mechanism that would kill Adam Petty in May 2000. The same mechanism that would kill Kenny Irwin Jr. in July 2000. The same mechanism that would kill Tony Roper in October 2000. The same mechanism that would kill Dale Earnhardt himself in February of 2001. McDuffie was the first NASCAR Cup driver of the modern era to die from that specific injury, and his case received almost no formal investigation whatsoever. What did get investigated, and this is the part that almost nobody talks about, was an independent inquiry commissioned and paid for by Medford Speed, the New Jersey shop that had built his engine. They hired 2 accident investigators named Phil Moser and Terry Shaw to look at the wreckage and figure out what had actually killed him. And Moser and Shaw concluded something different from NASCAR. They concluded that at the moment of impact, a tire from the barrier itself had been driven up through the passenger side window opening and into the cockpit. They cited as evidence a black tar-like substance found smeared on the window glass. They cited damage to the foam padding of his helmet on the right side. They cited damage to the microphone tab on his helmet. The picture they painted was that one of those barrier tires had come through the passenger window and struck McDuffie on the right jaw. His daughter Linda told journalist Ed Hinton years later that her daddy's jawbone had been driven up through his skull. Imogen told Hinton that McDuffie bled to death upside down in the car and that the car was full of blood. Those are the words of the family, and they deserve to be heard. So now you have 2 competing explanations. NASCAR says it was a rapid head movement injury. The privately commissioned Moser and Shaw report says it was an intrusion injury from a barrier tire coming through the window. Both could be partially true. But we cannot answer that question definitively, and the reason we cannot answer it is because the wheel itself, the failed spindle, the actual mechanical evidence that started the entire crash, was never returned to the family. It vanished from NASCAR custody. Brock Beard, who wrote the only serious book-length biography of McDuffie in 2018, documents this directly. NASCAR declined to investigate the accident. The car left the racetrack before the conclusion of the race. The wheel disappeared. We do not know to this day what specifically broke. Whether it was the spindle proper, the hub, the stud pattern, or a brake rotor attachment, we simply do not know. The evidence is gone. Imogene filed suit in 1992 against NASCAR and Watkins Glen International, asking for $4.25 million. In September 1993, Judge Michael Teleska granted summary dismissal. He ruled that McDuffie had been well aware of the dangers and had voluntarily assumed the risk. Case dismissed. Watkins Glen quietly announced the construction of the bus stop chicane less than 2 months after McDuffie died, publicly claiming it had nothing to do with the accidents at the Glen. The chicane was operational for 1992. Driver speeds entering the old Turn 5 complex were cut dramatically. Whatever the official position was, the racetrack quietly fixed the problem that had killed J.D. McDuffie on its own dime while denying it needed fixing at all. The cost of how lightly NASCAR treated the McDuffie investigation came due over the next 10 years in the most devastating way possible. In 1994 at Daytona, journeyman driver Rodney Orr was killed in a practice crash that broke his neck. 4 days later, Neil Bonnet was killed in another practice crash at Daytona with the same fundamental injury pattern. In May of 2000 at Loudon, New Hampshire, Adam Petty, Richard Petty's grandson, was killed in a Busch Series practice crash. Basilar skull fracture. 8 weeks later, at the same racetrack, Kenny Irwin Jr. was killed in a Cup practice crash. Same mechanism. Same injury. In October of 2000 at Texas Motor Speedway, Tony Roper was killed in a Truck Series crash. Basilar skull fracture. And then on February 18, 2001, on the last lap of the Daytona 500, Dale Earnhardt, the same Dale Earnhardt who had walked through the garage 10 years earlier with a hat in his hand collecting $6,600 to keep McDuffie on the racetrack, hit the Turn 4 wall at about 157 miles per hour. Basilar skull fracture. He was not wearing a head and neck restraint device. Here is what most people don't realize about the timeline. A device called the Hans device, designed to prevent exactly the kind of basilar skull fracture that killed McDuffie, had been on the market since 1991. The same year McDuffie died. Dr. Robert Hubbard and Jim Downing had been selling the device for $3,000 to $5,000 apiece since the year McDuffie's wheel came off at Watkins Glen. Brett Bodine wore one at Daytona in July 2000. Kyle Petty wore one. They were the first 2 Cup drivers to do so, almost 9 years after McDuffie's death. NASCAR did not mandate the Hans device or an equivalent head and neck restraint for all Cup competition until October 2001, 10 years and 1 month after McDuffie died. Between McDuffie and that mandate, there were 5 Cup or top-tier fatalities. The McDuffie case had set the template for the injury, and the institutional response had set the template for the inaction. Now, I want to be careful here because the historical record does not permit us to say with certainty that if NASCAR had taken McDuffie's death seriously in August 1991, the Hans device would have been mandated in 1992 and Earnhardt and the others would have lived. The device was unproven in stock car applications at the time. The sample size was small. The political friction inside the sport against mandating a $3,000 piece of gear that drivers complained was uncomfortable would have been enormous regardless. What we can say is this. The information was there. The device was on the market. The injury mechanism was identifiable from McDuffie's autopsy. The pattern was about to repeat itself 5 more times in 10 years. And the institutional response in August 1991 was to lose the failed wheel, dismiss the family's lawsuit, and move on. The team in Sanford did not survive him. In 1995, the remaining assets of McDuffie Racing went up for auction. The 2 surviving Pontiacs were bought by a collector for $6,900. All blue, the 1970 Chevrolet Ramp truck, was sold for $7,750 and is currently displayed by Bailey Excavating in Michigan, one of McDuffie's longtime sponsors. Imogene lived on for 30 more years and died on August 8, 2021, the exact same week as the 30th anniversary of her husband's death. She was 83 years old. Their son Jeff, who had been the crew chief on the day his father died, passed away in October of 2024 at the age of 62. In 2021, the city of Sanford commissioned an artist named Chris Dalton to paint a memorial mural on a wall in Carthage Square. The mural shows J.D. McDuffie smiling. It carries his motto in 2 words: never quit. His daughter Linda was there for the dedication. She was the last of the immediate family present that day. So back to the wheel. The thing that started this entire story. The piece of evidence that should have been preserved, investigated, documented, photographed, and made part of a permanent record. Where it actually ended up, nobody at NASCAR has ever said. The institutional pattern that killed J.D. McDuffie was not malice. It was inattention. It was the sport's willingness to treat the death of an unsponsored privateer in an old car as a sad isolated event rather than as a warning about a class of injury that was going to happen again and again. J.D. McDuffie was 52 years old. He had been racing for 28 years. He had started 653 Winston Cup races. He had won 1 pole at Dover in 1978 on McCreary tires when everybody else was on Goodyear. He had never won a race. He had earned $1,338,000 over a career that spanned the entire modern era of stock car racing. He was the last of a kind of racer that this country produced for about 40 years and then stopped producing. There are no more independents. There are no more guys living out of a ramp truck and a shop behind their house. The corporate sport won. He lost. But he kept showing up right up to the morning of August 11, 1991. And whatever else you want to say about J.D. McDuffie, that fact is the truth of his life. He kept showing up. Never quit.